Since we each arrived in Chicago in the same year, Rabbi Reiss has been a recurrent guest lecturer at Anshe Shalom, and it's always an honor, it's always a privilege, and it's always stimulating to hear Rabbi Reiss speak. His topic for the next 3 shiurim is on the Halakhic response to the September 11th terror attacks, which I think he'll share, but it's one way in which religion can be a source of comfort and a source of dignity and honor and reconciliation and peace in the world in the aftermath of tragedy, and a way, I think, to preserve human dignity in the face of mass violence, as we will hear. So, Reiss, please.
Thank you very much, Rabbi Wolkenfeld. It's always good to speak about preserving human dignity, especially in the aftermath of a national election. Gives you a sense of perspective to speak about the 9/11 tragedy. I think somebody commented that Hillary Clinton died a death of 1,000 cuts in terms of her candidacy, and one of the cuts was when she suffered a collapse during the 15th anniversary 9/11 commemoration, when she got fatigued after standing outside in the sun for a long period of time. So I guess that is somewhat in Yona, somewhat related to the affairs and events of the last couple of days. But I suppose that it's timely in the sense that it reminds you that regardless of your reaction to different events and how cataclysmic you may find it, I know that yesterday some people were crying and other people were celebrating, so that's all a question of perspective when it's a presidential election. But regardless of one's perspective, there's always a framework for dealing with it. And that's one of the wonderful things about Jewish law, is that it says, you know what, there's always a framework. It doesn't matter what happens. We have precedent. We have a way of dealing with it. We have sources, and we have a structure. There's something very comforting in having that structure, and that was very much the sense of those who turned to rabbinic authorities in the aftermath of 9/11, specifically with respect to the questions of Agunah resolution. So I'm going to break this down into 3 parts. We have anticipated a 3-part lecture series. Today, we'll talk about the way in which the questions of missing husbands from the perspective of Jewish law was dealt with by the rabbinical courts in the aftermath of the 9/11 tragedy. The next session will deal with other ancillary Halakhic issues, such as when does mourning begin when somebody is presumed dead but their remains have not been found, and other Halakhic issues. Are you allowed to shoot down a plane according to Jewish law that's about to crash into a building, killing people, when you're going to be shooting down a plane that will be taking innocent human lives, even if they otherwise would die anyway? And the third session will talk about Kohanim in 9/11. If somebody is from priestly lineage and they're not allowed to come into contact with corpses or with parts even of dead bodies, that's why Kohanim can't go to medical school. I remember when my wife gave birth, so her gynecologist was a Kohen and the anesthesiologist was a Kohen, and then 2 months later she went for gallbladder surgery and the surgeon was a Kohen and the anesthesiologist were a Kohen, and they were all from. So I can't explain that so much, but I was told growing up that a Kohen can't go to medical school. And I'm also a Kohen. Of course, it gave me a convenient excuse to explain to my mother why I couldn't be a doctor, so that worked out just fine. It's all premised upon this basic rule that a Kohen is not supposed to come into contact with corpses or with parts of corpses. So how does that impact on the ability of a Kohen nowadays to go to the 9/11 site, to go to that area, the ground zero area, What about the museum, the 9/11 museum, where the remains of the bodies that have not yet been identified or delivered to the families of the victims are still being stored? Are Kohanim allowed to go to the museum? So we'll talk about some of those issues and related issues. So that's the anticipated breakdown of the 3 different sessions. So we'll start with the first one. I was very involved, actually, in some of these deliberations. It happens that when the 9/11 tragedy occurred, I was working in New York City as the director, the menahel, of the Beit of America. That's the rabbinical court affiliated with the Rabbinical Council of America and with the Orthodox Union. I just sort of fell into that job. I had been working as an attorney for a number of years, and like most associates at major law firms, was looking for an escape hatch of some sort. And I decided at one point that I really wanted to complete my studies in receiving not only the regular smicha, which I already had, but a smicha in Jewish jurisprudence. So I decided I would take a 1-year leave of absence from my law firm work, which I was graciously granted by my law firm. They were willing to let me go for a year and leave my position open. That was very nice. And while I was studying for my Yadin Smicha, my degree in Jewish jurisprudence, during that year, I was brought in to help out on a volunteer basis at the Beit of America, because that institution itself, which had been around since 1960, was in the process of being revitalized by a new rabbinic board, a new lay board. They wanted to bring in rabbis with legal expertise, with commercial marketplace expertise, who would be able to understand the realities of the contemporary commercial and legal world, and thereby be able to adjudicate cases for the Jewish community in a more informed and worldly fashion. So I was considered to be a good catch for that purpose, and I was taking off the year anyway. And then they liked me so much that at the conclusion of the year, they asked me to stay on as director. And the person who had been serving as the interim startup director of the new reconstituted Beit was also a professor of law at Emory University Law School, and he decided to go back to Emory at the end of that year. So I was the only one left in the office. I just changed the stationery and made myself director. And I informed my law firm, and they thought I was out of my mind. And actually asked me, this was really weird, because this was a big law firm where you wouldn't expect this type of accommodation, but they asked me if I could stay on part-time. Whenever I would find a few hours, they would pay me by the hour, because they really were short-staffed and needed my contribution. So for a year and a half or so afterwards, I was working both at the Beit and at my law firm. My law firm, it happens, was located at what I used to call the Big Black Brooks Brothers building. It was one Liberty Plaza. It had a Brooks Brothers shop on the first floor, and it was right across the street from the World Trade Center. And I lived in Manhattan at the time on 66th Street and Amsterdam Avenue. I would take the subway station from 66th and Broadway down to Cortlandt Street, which was essentially the World Trade Center. And I would get off at the World Trade Center concourse every single day. That's where I went to work. I would go through the World Trade Center concourse, and there was an escalator connection between the World Trade Center concourse and my building, which was across the street, but the buildings in the basement were connected to each other. So when there was a terrorist attack to the garage of the World Trade Center, I think that was in 1993, when that occurred, my entire building shook. It was like this bolt of thunder. There was such a strong and loud sound and sensation. I thought that it was some thunderstorm outside, and I got up and I said, "Shkochu b'rasam alayolem," and I didn't realize it was a bomb blast. So I was actually right there during the first attack. But at that time, by 2001, I had already taken this position at the Beit. After a couple of years at the Beit picked up in terms of its reputation, thank God, in terms of its volume, that I wasn't able to maintain both positions. And I remember notifying the law firm at one point in time that I just couldn't juggle both anymore. It was getting too onerous, although it was kind of fun in a way that there I was in the not-for-profit rabbinic world working as director of the Beit, and when I felt like it, I could just sort of switch gears and close and go into my Wall Street law firm and play lawyer for a few days. But after a certain point in time, especially after I got married, it became too overwhelming. I didn't want my wife to get the wrong idea. She should expect that I should become a Wall Street lawyer again. So I decided, okay, I'll put that to the side. And I was working there at the Beit of America at the time of September 11, 2001, which was located on 7th Avenue and 27th Street. And I remember that day that I was about to leave my home. I was living in Riverdale. At that time, we had moved to Riverdale in the Bronx, and I just turned on the radio to listen to the news, and there was some report about some plane that crashed into the top of one of the towers of the World Trade Center, and like most people, I thought this was somebody's private jet that just got out of control, and it was an unfortunate accident, but that life would go on, that it wouldn't be quite some earth-shattering event. And then, as I traveled to work, all of a sudden the subways stopped, and they said everybody has to get out. The subways are no longer going to be functioning today. And it turned out that this was something much more serious. The World Trade Center building was up in flames, and then that was the North Tower. There was also a South Tower, and then the South Tower was hit. I think about 15 minutes after the North Tower was hit, and there were two buildings that were up in flames, and we realized that something quite catastrophic was occurring, although I think people were still confused and in a daze. And I remember walking from where I was left off at the 42nd Street station. It was the Port Authority station, and I walked the rest of the way to work on 27th Street. And when I got into my building, I got a fuller report from my fellow office mates who had already arrived at work, saying that the city was essentially closing down. Maybe we should go home, and who knows, maybe we're all in danger. And you could see the smoke bellowing from downtown. If you looked outside of the windows of our building, and it was clear that this was a very, very serious and very cataclysmic situation. And eventually, I don't remember exactly how, somebody picked me up and gave me a ride, and it was all very surreal. Eventually, I made my way home. I remember that was the day that nobody was calling the Beit for any business, because nobody could imagine thinking about anything that day other than the welfare of those who were trapped in the buildings. And when the buildings collapsed, afterwards, all the lives that had been lost, and we were walking around in a daze for a couple of days. The only phone call that I remember receiving on 9/11 was from a woman in Brooklyn who had been petitioning for a get from her husband, and she was not happy with the way in which the get was being delayed by the husband, and somehow she got through to me. And it was also weird because there was almost no mention of 9/11. Maybe she wasn't even aware of it. She was an elderly woman. The good news is that I remember very well that case did actually get resolved, and she did receive a get eventually from her husband. So maybe that was a good omen with respect to how we would be able to resolve to the best of our ability the other 9/11 cases. So I remember that about a day or two later, when I was in the office, and those of you who were, well, I guess most of you, were already adults or old enough at the time to follow what was going on during those tumultuous days. Most people were just affixed to the television sets and watching everything that was going on. We did not have television reception officially in our house, but there was some cable wire that was never properly disconnected from the previous owner, so sometimes we were able to access things. And we called up the cable company and told them, we're very upfront about it, but they said, don't worry about it. So we had access to some cable reception. And during those days, I remember it was weird. Normally we only had access to 1 or 2 channels. Somehow every single channel became available, only during those 3 days. So we saw everything, every single view, every single angle. I mean, I saw some absolutely horrible footage. Men in their suits jumping from the 100th floor. I still remember those images. They're very vividly embedded in my head, and we didn't really, think of anything from a Jewish law perspective until a couple of days after the tragedy. Rabbi Stephen Dworkin, who at that point, alav hashalom, he passed away. He was at that point the executive vice president of the Rabbinical Council of America. So he came to me and he said, there are all these men who worked in the World Trade Center, women too, but in terms of the Agunah situations, there were women, Jewish men who worked there, who are presumed dead, but whose remains have not been found and may never be found. And these women are going to need some type of a Jewish law resolution that the husbands are considered to be dead from a Jewish law perspective, so that they will not be agunot, so that they will not be trapped and unable to remarry. And I said, oh yeah, I hadn't thought of that. To be perfectly honest, we dealt with Agunah situations, but more modern day Agunah situations. The classical Agunah situation that's dealt with in the Gemara, this is source number 1 of the sheets, is a fellow who falls into water. If a married man who falls into a body of water, and witnesses see that he falls into a body of water, but they didn't see that he died, they assume he didn't come up from the water, he must have died. So the Gemara says you can't always assume that the man died just because he fell into a body of water if you don't actually have the remains to identify. Why is that? Because if it's an unbounded body of water, what we call mayim ein lahem sof, like an ocean, there's a chance that the witnesses saw the person fall into the water and that the person somehow swam far away underneath the water or grabbed onto a log and managed to travel far beyond the purview of the witness and was able to emerge far away from that spot and come on shore alive and well, but not known to the witness that he had survived. And therefore, any witness or witnesses that saw the person fall in could not say with certainty that the person had not emerged at some more distant location far away in the water. As opposed to, if a person fell into a mayim sheyesh lahem himself, into a bounded body of water, like a lake or not Lake Michigan, but a small lake, where the person would be able to see the boundaries of the water, then if the witnesses saw that the person didn't emerge, it would be known that the person died because they could not have emerged at some further point in the distance that is beyond the purview of the witness. So this was the classic type of Agunah case that was described in the Talmud, the man who we're pretty sure is dead, meaning the probability is based on the fact that he fell into the water and we didn't see him come out, he's dead, but we can't say with absolute certainty that he's dead. And the Gemara says that we hold that if the person fell into the unbounded body of water, we have to be worried about the small possibility that maybe he emerged far away and we didn't find out about his whereabouts. Maybe he took it as an opportunity to get away from his wife or from his creditors, or he's otherwise being held captive somewhere, and we're not able to access him. And therefore, the wife is not permitted to remarry unless you have an absolute certainty that the person survived. And the Gemara tells a story of a person who fell into an unbounded body of water, mayim shein lahem sof, and it was assumed that the person died where was there? There's a famous story like this in literature too. Was it Huckleberry Finn or something? It was assumed that the person died, and they had a whole funeral for the person. And then in the middle of the eulogies, the missing person walked in to see that there was this grand, giant funeral being held in their honor. And the rabbis saw this incident, and they said, we see from here how wise our sages were, that they said that you should not assume that a man is dead just because he fell into a body of water and we didn't see him emerge. So that was the classical Agunah situation that was described in the Talmud. And the Talmud had all kinds of leniencies. That's where we have our principle of Mishum Agunah, Akilu Bei Rabbanan, that when we're dealing with Agunah cases, the rabbis exercise special leniencies, that they said normally we require 2 witnesses, here even 1 witness will suffice, and normally it has to be a kosher male witness above 13. Here we'll allow, if it be a witness who's female, we'll allow it if it's a witness who's a relative. We'll even allow the wife herself to testify that her husband died. We relax normal evidentiary rules. The reason why we do that is because we say that because of the enormity of the consequences, if we should get it wrong, that it would turn out that the wife, if she remarries, would be committing adultery, and any child born would be illegitimate, would be a mamzer, would be illegitimate, that isha daiko mitzvah, a woman's going to be very careful before she relies upon any kind of testimony, and therefore we can allow lesser forms of testimony. But some testimony is still necessary, meaning we still have to establish the fact from somebody reliable that the person fell into water from which they could not have emerged alive, because had they emerged alive, the witness would have seen them. So even if I had 2 witnesses, but the 2 witnesses saw that the person fell into an unbounded body of water, then the wife would still not be permitted to remarry. So that's the classic Agunah case. We would deal much more with the modern-day Agunah case. What's the modern-day Agunah case? That's the case where the husband did not fall into any kind of body of water. The husband is alive and well and walking around and going to minyan. It's just that he's refusing to give his wife a get. That's the case where the wife wishes that he would fall into a body of water, but unfortunately the scoundrel is all too much alive. So not that we forgot about the Talmudic case, but it just never really came up in our normal day-to-day practice, and Rabbi Dworkin correctly pointed out that this was a variation or application of this type of circumstance, not a person falling into a body of water, but again, a similar type of assessment that would need to be made, that we know that the person got engulfed in flames or was in a location where they likely would have plunged 100 stories down. Would you apply the same type of reasoning to say that as long as you had some type of a witness, whether a Jewish witness, a non-Jewish witness, male, female, relative, non-relative, but some sort of a witness that would be able to place the individual in a location where they definitely would have died, is that good enough according to Jewish law? So the answer is it probably would be good enough according to Jewish law. That's source number 3. Source number 3 says, in the same sugya, the same Gemara, the same Talmudic passage in Tractate Yevamos, that nafal asel kip shaneish means in a love. If witnesses see, or one witness sees, that a man falls into a fiery furnace, we can testify on behalf of his wife that he is dead. And then there's the whole discussion of, well, what if the person fell into a fiery furnace, but they're like a Houdini? Maybe how do we know the person couldn't have figured out a way out of the fiery furnace? Or maybe they're like the famous biblical figures, Hananiah, Mishael, Azariah, who were placed into a fiery furnace and they miraculously were rescued by God. So maybe you should be concerned about miracles. So Tosfos, that's source number 4, in the commentary to this Talmudic passage, Tosfos quotes the Yerushalmi that says that maybe we can't rely upon the testimony of somebody falling into a fiery furnace, because perhaps the person was rescued through the intervention of a miracle. So do we have to worry about miracles? So the answer is, that we pray for miracles, but we don't count on miracles. So we certainly prayed for a miracle, but in the normal course, it could be safely assumed the Talmud Bavli, the Babylonian Talmud, worked with the assumption that we don't worry about miracles unless we know that a miracle occurred. And therefore, if in the normal course a person falls into a fiery furnace, they would not escape, then that would be considered to be good enough. So these were some of the considerations that we had to think about. Then the next question was, how do we go about the practical process of helping those who are in need of assistance? So we worked together with the Rabbinical Council of America and with the Orthodox Union on sending out announcements to all the Jewish communities saying that if anybody knew of such a situation where there was a missing husband and there was a need for a rabbinical court determination of that, then we would be prepared to work with the families. And we started doing our research and gathering our rabbinic resources and our rabbinic authorities together. And a number of different rabbis, approximately 12 different rabbis from different communities, contacted us and said that they had women in their communities who were married to men who were presumed dead based on the 9/11 terrorist attack, and that they would like to turn to us. So we prepared letters for the women to sign so that they would authorize us to speak to various authorities, various municipal authorities, who would be able to provide any information about their missing husbands, or people who were co-workers who might have seen the husbands on that day. And it was a short letter. And I kept copies of the letters that we prepared at the time without really thinking that these had any kind of historic import. Later on, the Museum of Jewish Heritage in New York asked us for a stash of some of the letters that we had prepared and some of the work that we had done. It turned out that it was considered to be somewhat historic, but at the time we were just doing our work. The letter says, I hereby authorize the Beit of America to handle the Jewish law matters involved, including access to relevant police, medical, and employment records of my husband, who was missing in the September 11th attack on the World Trade Center, and each of the letters were notarized. And then we met with each of the wives and we gathered information from them regarding what time their husbands left that day, what was the state of their marriage, what was the state of their financial affairs, would the husband have reason to try to use this as an excuse for escaping from his various troubles. And we also gathered information from co-workers, whether they saw the husbands that day, whether they could place them. Most of the co-workers who would have seen the husbands would also have died that day, but some people left work early, had to go to meetings. So we spoke, and if there were firms that prepared reports, we were given access to the reports. And also, we had to be prepared for the possibility that maybe a bodily identification would be made. If a bodily identification would be made, maybe they would find the finger, maybe they would find a part of a skull where a person could be identified through dental records, or a finger through fingerprint records, that we needed to be able to get access to those records as well. So we quickly established a relationship with the New York City Medical Examiner's Office, which wasn't located that far away from us. And they would regularly contact us about all identifications that were made. We were on their fax list, and every day they would send us faxes about all the identifications that were made, so we could see if they made any identification based on any of the men whose wives had turned to us for Jewish law determinations. According to Jewish law, there are rules about what identifications are considered to be acceptable and not acceptable, so that also was something that had to be reckoned with. So we then sent follow-up letters to the women after we met with them, based on another meeting that took place. There was a meeting that was organized by the Jewish Council, JCRC. What was it, JCRC stand? Jewish Community Relations Council. So the Jewish Community Relations Council organized a meeting where they brought together major rabbinic authorities in New York, and they figured they would invite the heads of all the rabbinical courts. So who did they invite? They invited us, representing the Beit of America, and Rabbinical Council of America, Rabbinical Court, They also invited the head of the joint Beit of the conservative movement, Rabbi Meir Rabinowitz, was at this meeting, and they brought in a forensic expert from Israel who worked closely with detectives and with investigators in Israel. His name, and with the police in Israel, his name was Dr. Jay Levinson, and he had developed an expertise in modern-day techniques of identification, and he was in close touch with the major rabbinic authorities in Israel about their assessment of what's considered to be acceptable or not, particularly with respect to this newfangled type of identification called DNA identification. DNA identification became much more advanced as a result of the 9/11 tragedy because authorities wanted to work so hard at bringing back the remains of the loved ones of different families to other family members. They were incentivized to figure out new and advanced ways of DNA identification, even with the smallest fragments of skin or bone, so that they would be able to help bring closure to families who were in the grieving process after 9/11. So we met with him about DNA identification, and it was interesting. The Jewish Community Relations Council also wanted to help. I don't know what else they do, because I don't have that much to do with the Jewish Community Relations Council, but this was really one of my very few interactions. But I think they have something to do with the Israeli Day Parade. But they really wanted to play a significant role in developing a protocol for helping to resolve these Agunah cases. So they said, why not, we'll refer all the Orthodox cases to the Beit of America, all the conservative cases to the joint Beit, and it was very, very interesting. I, of course, volunteered because I'm a very broad-minded, person, and I have a very inclusive personality. I said, we don't have to be so parochial about it. We're happy to handle all of the cases. And in the end, that's really what ended up happening, that we were given cases from the conservative community as well. People just came to us because we had a reputation, and we were happy to work with everybody to resolve their various situations. And also, we had a very thorough process, and I think people appreciated that. The head of the joint Beit said, anybody who comes to us, all that we need is just a letter saying the husband worked in the World Trade Center, and we have a letter already prepared. So I think people wanted more than that. They wanted something that felt more thorough and felt more authentic. I don't know, maybe something like that. The truth is that everybody really worked together, and there was something very, very beautiful about that. So after that meeting, once we learned about the possibility of DNA identifications, so we wrote a more detailed letter to the wives, and I have a copy. This was sent out on October 11, 2001, in which we asked very specific questions. Before Mr. Blank left the house in the morning, did he specifically say he was going to work? What time did he leave? How long does the trip take? Does he usually travel to work with someone else so we can interview that other person? If the answer to question number 4 is yes, can we contact the other person? Does he drive or take a subway? Are there easy pass or metro records available? Did he take his usual work materials, a briefcase lunch that morning? Did he call home? If so, when and from where? What did he say? How can one contact the employer to ask further questions? Have you been contacted by city agencies concerning DNA samples? Please make sure, and we put this in bold, please make sure not to throw away hairbrushes, toothbrushes, shavers, etc. that may contain DNA evidence. And we had this very, very thorough checklist that we presented, so we could receive all of the pinpointed information that we need. And we got in touch with the Manhattan Transit Authority, and we got in touch with the Port Authority to get really, really detailed records. The New York Times, to their credit, on September 12th, had this really extensive and detailed diagram of exactly when the planes hit, where they hit, how many people were presumed dead. It was astonishingly accurate. Even in the months and months that followed, as new information came in, it was a really accurate diagram. It was just the day afterwards. I have to give them a lot of credit for that. But we really learned a lot about the building and where the elevator banks were, and how long it would take to go up the building, how long it would take to go down the building from different offices, because we really had to understand all of this in order to be able to assess the probative value of the evidence in each of the cases as to where the men were located. So after we met with the wives, we compiled the evidence. We had to go through our halakhic analysis, and what we found was that there were really 4 types of different cases that we had to that we had to consider. The first type of case was where the man could be placed based on testimony in a location from which it would be akin to this kivshan ha'esh, meaning the equivalent of falling into a bounded body of water where you know for sure that the man died, or the equivalent of seeing that the man fell into a fiery furnace in which you know that nobody would have been able to escape, and therefore he could definitely be presumed dead, because that's what we call a definite type of determination, as opposed to merely a probable determination, which would not be good enough according to Jewish law. The second type of category would be where there was only a probable determination of death based on the testimony. That would be akin to the Mayim She'ein Lahem Sof type of situation. If you have Mayim She'ein Lahem Sof, which is like the unbounded waters case, so then there seems to be some basis for the conclusion that if you have that testimony plus other evidence as well that would establish a probability of death, so those 2 things combined can lead to a determination that the person is dead. Where does that come from the perspective of Jewish law? So it's sort of interesting. It comes from a source that seems to prove the opposite. But sometimes in Jewish law you can prove things from the opposite, because the fact that you have something even considered as a hava mina, even if it's rejected, so things that are considered can then be revived afterwards under the right set of circumstances. It's one of the different methodologies of Talmudic learning. So the specific Talmudic passage in question is number 2, is source number 2 in the materials, and that is where just to give the background, the Talmud had said that maybe if you had somebody fall into unbounded body of water, and they were a great celebrity, they were like, somebody like a rock star, okay, like, somebody who everybody would care about, would want to know about. What was the equivalent of a rock star in the days of the Talmud? Like a rabbinic scholar, a young rabbinic scholar. So if you had a young rabbinic scholar, so this is somebody like really, really famous, so the Gemara says, well, maybe then it would be sufficient testimony, even if the witness just saw them fall into unbounded bodies of water, because if they had emerged somewhere else, we surely would have found out about it, because it would be headline news. And therefore, maybe we can rely on that combination of probabilities. Probability number 1, they fell into a body of water where most people died. Probability number 2, even if they survived, we almost surely would have heard about it. So the Gemara rejects that. So Tosfos says, this is source number 2, that even though in a majority of cases, if he had survived, word would have spread, we don't rely upon such majority. So many authorities derive from there that we don't rely upon multiple probabilities, that even if I have 2 probabilities, then I put the 2 probabilities together, that's not good enough. So says Rabbi Yisrael Isserlein, this is source number 5, also known as the Truma Sedeshin. Truma Sedeshin wrote a book of Shilas Teshuvos, of answers to different questions, like many rabbinic authorities. They write Shilas Teshuvos, answers to questions. Only most rabbinic authorities wait for the questions, and then they give the answers. The Truma Sedeshin didn't wait around for questions. He just made up his own questions, and then he gave the answers to the questions that he made up. So that's sort of a unique approach of his Sefer. So Truma Sedeshin talks about this issue, and the Truma Sedeshin says, in our days, I'll just read the English translation, in our days, even a person who's not a rabbinic scholar, if he survived, this fact would be much more publicized than the publicity of even a Talmudic scholar's survival in the days of the Talmud, because in the days of Truma Sedeshin in the 15th century, Already they had much more advanced modes of communication. And therefore he said that the only reason we rejected the double probability in the time of the Tosfos, or the time of the Talmud, was because then we would have to distinguish between celebrities, like rabbinic scholars, and other individuals. And we don't have rules that would require us to distinguish between different types of individuals. But nowadays, where anybody would be more readily identified or heard about if they disappeared and they reemerged somewhere else because of our advanced modes of communication. Therefore, this is an additional probability that can be taken into account. So what we learn from the Trumas Hadeshin is that if I have multiple probabilities, that's something which can lead to resolution. Now, if the second probability you're relying upon is the fact that we haven't heard from the individual, so that might be a little bit more difficult, as some of the authorities mentioned, to rely upon by itself, because how much time needs to elapse where you can safely assume that the person is not coming back. Like in the aftermath of the World Trade Center, there was one fellow who worked as a street vendor where the family, he disappeared after the towers collapsed, and the family assumed that he had died. And it was declared that the person died together with everybody else. And 6 months later, he turned up in a hospital. Apparently, he had been wandering the streets. He was all disoriented and disheveled. He may not have been psychologically 100% to begin with. He may not have had a perfectly functional relationship with his other family members. But the point is that it was assumed, based on the circumstances, that he had died. And it turned out that he was alive and needed to be hospitalized. So the question is, if you're going to rely upon that probability, how much time has to elapse? And there you have differences of opinion. Some say 2 years, some say 3 years, some say different periods of time. We wouldn't have wanted these women to have to wait around for an extensively arduous period of time until the cases could be resolved. So that's like case number 2. Case number 3 is where a positive physical identification was made. And case number 4 would be the most difficult type of case, and that is where you don't even have the witness or witnesses who are able to place the person in a mayim she'ein lahem sof situation, in some type of situation where you can establish a probability of death because nobody was able to testify that they made it to work that day. Just that they left for work doesn't mean that they actually ended up there. With the first type of case, they mostly involved men who worked for the firm of Cantor Fitzgerald, which was a bond trading firm on the uppermost 4 floors of the North Tower. And there, every single worker who made it to work that morning and stayed at work that morning perished, because they were above the point of impact where the plane went into the North Tower. The plane went to the North Tower somewhere between around the 93rd floor, So everybody who worked above the 93rd floor died in the North Tower. Pretty much everybody who worked below the 93rd floor survived in the North Tower, but everybody who was above that point in the North Tower died. And according to the research that we did, the plane hit the North Tower in such a way that the top of the building was severed from the bottom of the building. There were no points of passageway, neither elevators nor staircases, through which somebody would have been able to go down after the plane hit the North Tower. So as long as we could establish that the person was in their office at the point in time after the building had been hit, there was no way for them to escape. Either they would have been engulfed in the flames, or they would have plunged to their deaths 100 floors below. So in each one of the cases, we were able, in most of those cases, we were able to either collect evidence from the wife or from friends that they spoke to the individuals while they were in their office, and they said things to the effect of, I'm in my office, something happened, our building was hit, but we're staying put until we can figure out what to do. We're going to try to get out from our offices, and of course, unfortunately, tragically, they weren't able to, but that was the nature of the conversation. On the basis of those conversations, that provided us with a sufficient testimony that we could say this is like Kivshon Ha'esh, and the husbands definitely would have died, and therefore the wives are permitted to remarry. Second type of case would be, for example, we had several cases of men who worked in the South Tower. Remember, there were a couple of men who worked, for example, at the New York State Department of Taxation, which was between the 86th and 87th floor of the South Tower. What happened with the South Tower? A lot of these people had conversations confirming they were in fact there in the South Tower between the time that the North Tower was hit and the South Tower was hit, because after the North Tower was hit and the news got out, so they had conversations with their family members saying what was happening, and often and some of the conversations were to the effect of, I'm going to try to get out of the building, or we're going to stay in the building and see what happens, because maybe it'll be worse if we leave the building. But the work conversations were based on the conversations, even the phone records, because sometimes they called from their landlines, or were called on their landlines, that we would be able to determine that they were definitely in their office, creating at least a probability of death, but not a certainty of death, for the simple reason that the South Tower, the way it was hit at around 9:03 in the morning, was that it was hit in a zigzag fashion around the 78th floor, and because it was hit in a zigzag fashion as opposed to a clean cut fashion, there was actually still one passageway that remained navigable even after the tower was hit. And we know of approximately a dozen people who were able to get out of the South Tower from the 78th floor and above, even after the South Tower was hit. 78th floor was a very important floor because that was the express elevator bank in both of the buildings. So everybody who worked in the uppermost floors would have to first go from the first floor to the 78th floor, then from the 78th floor to the upper floors. So in these cases, just establishing that they were there did not create a definite conclusion of death, but just a probability of death, so it wasn't good enough. But at least in one of the cases, they also found a pair of pants that had one of the individual's wallet and his house keys and his car keys and a pair of sunglasses that belonged to him. So that by itself is not considered to be ironclad, rocket solid evidence, for the simple reason that the Gemara says, Chayshinan l'she'ela. We're worried that sometimes people loan out their objects. But then the Gemara says, certain objects people are less likely to loan out, like their keys and their wallets. Here we had both the keys and the wallets. So later rabbinic authorities say, well, maybe we're worried even about keys and wallets, but if you have the key and the wallet together in a pair of pants with unidentified remains, unfortunately in this case, the remains were crushed so badly that they were never actually able to be identified through DNA identification, but because of the fact that we had those identifying pieces of the person's personal items together with the fact that we had evidence placing them in the building. It's interesting how we were able to place that particular individual in the building was through another case that just happened to come to us. There was a man who came to us and said, my wife is missing. Do I need a Jewish law determination to be able to remarry? So you also need a Jewish law determination. It's what we call an Agun. It's not only Agunah, it's also Agun, because in that case, it wouldn't lead to illegitimacy or adultery, at least according to biblical law. So all that's needed in order to permit the man to remarry is a probability of death. You don't need more than the Mayim She'ein Lahem self-standard in such a case. But we spoke in that case to the mother of the missing wife, and the mother of the missing wife said, yes, I spoke to my daughter, and she said she's at her desk with the New York Department of State Department of Taxation, and that she was sitting next to so-and-so, her co-worker. So that's how we knew this co-worker who was this missing man, that's how we were able to place him at work. Otherwise, we wouldn't have been able to place him at work. So it was interesting how one case kind of helped out the other. So that was the second type of case. We had one such case. The man worked in the South Tower. We had no additional corroborating evidence whatsoever, and we had to... I had an argument that we had multiple probabilities anyway, because most people who were in his situation died. He was seen right next to the elevator bank by a few people who went down the very last elevator before the South Tower got hit. They saw him talking to a Port Authority officer who said, don't worry that you shouldn't, I recommend that you not get into the elevator. You're much safer staying in the building. Go back to your office. They actually witnessed this conversation. You can't blame the Port Authority officer. He ended up dying too. They even knew the name of this officer because he worked there every day. So I corroborated that this person was listed amongst the missing who were declared dead afterwards. but we were never able to identify the person otherwise. But that created one probability. The other probability was that if the person would have gone down this rickety staircase that was filled with smoke and debris, they had a triage station where all the people who went down that one remaining navigable staircase passed through, and they took all the people to local hospitals, and there was no record that this person had gone to a local hospital. But even with all of that, we made sure to go through a process where we got the approbation of at least 3 rabbinical authorities, not only within our organization, but throughout the entire world, including Rabbi Nechemya Goldberg, including Rabbi Yosef. Rabbi Nechemya Goldberg said that I don't feel comfortable passing up on this unless you find yet another rabbinical authority. So after 3 years, we finally got Rav Nata Greenblatt from Memphis, Tennessee, to say enough time has passed, because nowadays, with all of the advanced modes of communication, the fact we haven't heard from the person is considered to be good enough, together with your ability to place the person in the building, that I give my haskama, I give my consent. So that's the second type of case. The third type of case were cases where we actually had a few cases where there were body parts that were identified. When there are body parts that are identified, the halacha is that if it's a siman muvhak, if it's an ironclad type of identification that less than 1 in 1,000, in a case where you have 3,000 people who die at one time, so it has to be less than 1 in 3,000 people would share the same characteristic. And certainly the unique formation of a person's teeth is such a characteristic. So one person, unfortunately, it was actually someone who worked in Cantor Fitzgerald. This was pretty incredible. They found, I mean, I hate to speak so graphically, but they found a skull that matched this person's dental records. And there was another case where there was fingerprint records that were able to be identified. But what about DNA? DNA is not visible to the eye. It's where you extract a certain cell coating from a skin fragment or something like that, and it matches the cell coating that you're able to derive from the person's toothbrush or hairbrush or shaver. So is that considered to be ironclad from the perspective of halakha? Well, the authorities will tell you that the probability of error, or the possibility of error, is less than 1 in 1 million, or often less than 1 in 1 trillion, or less than 1 in 1 quadrillion, but it still wasn't familiar to us. So we had this whole session with rabbinic authorities from all over. We had the Lakewood Betin that was also dealing with one case of their own. They came, and it was in the basement of the shul that was located almost across the street from the New York City Medical Examiner's Office, Congregation of Deret El, and we met one night with the medical examiner and with a DNA expert and with all these rabbis, and everybody was asking questions of how can you have a quadrillion possible different, configurations when humanity has only been around for 5,700 years, questions like that. It was very riveting discussion. But at the end, everybody agreed, and there was also a psak like this from Shmuel Vosner, who is a leading posek in Eretz Yisrael. He's since passed away at the age of 102 or something. So Shmuel Vosner ruled that DNA evidence could at least be taken into consideration as an additional factor. So we had cases, again, where a person worked in the South Tower, and we had a probability of death, and then we had a DNA identification, and we were given access by the medical examiner's office of their files, so we could even see how they went about making the DNA identifications. They were very generous to us in giving us access to their files, and we were able to make a determination on that basis. And Rabbi Nechemya Goldberg, an authority from Israel, said that even if you only had DNA identification, he thought that was good enough, because he said that you don't only need physically visible signs of identification, and he gave us a proof that the Gemara says that you can identify somebody even if you... What's a form of ironclad identification? A person has a peculiarly shaped nose, for example, that's unlike anybody else, or they have a formation of teeth unlike anybody else. We said that's not normally how we identify people. If you meet a friend in the street, you don't take out a ruler and measure their nose and their eyes to make sure it's your friend. You recognize them to Tfiyas Ayin. You know them when you see them. You just recognize them, because it's just like the totality of the person is unique. So said Rabbi Nechemya Goldberg, since you can identify a person through Tfiyas Ayin just by kind of recognizing their uniqueness, so a person's cell coding is also considered to be evidentiary admissible on the same basis, that every single person's cell coding is unique to that individual. It's not necessarily measurable physically, that you're physically measuring it, but this is a way in which you're able to identify a person's uniqueness. So therefore, if you know that a person has a particular cell coding, 13 loci in the cell that are arranged according to a certain coding, and it matches, so he says that would be considered to be ironclad on the very same basis. But in the end, we didn't have to identify anybody based on DNA alone, without also having evidence that they were in the building in a location where they probably would have died. And the fourth type of case that we had, and included, by the way, in some of these cases, were unusual situations. Like one case involved a person who actually was on one of the planes. They were on the American Airlines jet that crashed into the North Tower, and we think that they may have been the individual who reputedly actually tried to fight against the terrorists. There was some account that there was one person who had served in the army, in the Israeli army, and had fought against the terrorists. We thought this might have been, but the individual in that case, if they were on the plane, there's no way that they could have survived when the plane came crashing into a building. But we actually got in touch with the American Airlines, and based on the authority we were given, and they confirmed for us that the person received a boarding pass, and they went further and they said, and we don't have anybody who received the boarding pass who didn't actually board the plane, and we don't have any record of anyone who boarded the plane who left the plane afterwards, because we keep records of all of these things. So we were able to really have a very complete record in order to make our determination. So the last type of case was, we had one case like this where there was no witness that the person actually made it to work. So what did we do in that case? So you try to establish a pattern of behavior that would result in the logical conclusion that the person must have followed their normal pattern of behavior to have ended up at work that day. But even then, you have to establish that the person would have arrived at work at such a time that they would have gotten there prior to when the building was attacked. So that's a tricky proposition. But this is where the cooperative efforts with the MTA and the Port Authority came handy, because the person worked for a firm called Marsh-McLennan, which is an insurance firm, also above the point of impact on the North Tower. Not the South Tower, but the North Tower. So if they were there, there's no way that they could have survived. So it turns out the person, since they worked at this, a very sophisticated financial firm, people like that are usually pretty meticulous about their records. So we spoke to the widow. Turned out they normally took the subway every single day with a Metro card. Metro card is like this card you put through the subway's turnstiles in New York. And the person had acquired the Metro card with their credit card, so we got the credit card statement, so we were able to actually get the number of the Metro card, and then the MTA gave us the records of exactly what point in time every single day this person went through the 42nd Street station on their way to take the express train to the World Trade Center before arriving at work. So we got up until and including September 11th, the records of every single day, what time they went through the turnstiles using the Metro card, and we saw that this person followed his normal pattern of behavior. He didn't go somewhere else that day. Just like every day he went through the turnstiles around 8:10 in the morning or 8:12 in the morning. So it was a similar time that the card went through the turnstiles on that day. Also, we found that the Port Authority, which was in charge of the World Trade Center buildings, had swipe records, because every single person, in order to get into the World Trade Center, if they worked there, they needed to use a swipe card in order to enter into the building. So there were records as to when each person entered into the building, but not for September, because all of the records were destroyed. They went down with the building. What about a backup? They only backed up the records at night. And in fact, even the backup was in the basement of the World Trade Center, and all of that was destroyed as well for the month of September. But they had backed up off-site all of the records for the month of August. So we had all of the subway records as to when this person went through the subway turnstile at 42nd Street every single day up until and including September 11th. And we had the swipe card records for the month of August showing exactly when the person entered into the building every single day in the month of August. So we were able to do an algebraic equation in which we figured out exactly how long it took, what was the median amount of time that it took for the person to get from the 42nd Street subway station to the World Trade Center every single day, when the swipe card would typically bring them into the World Trade Center. We received evidence from people who worked within the World Trade Center as to how long it typically took to walk to the elevators and to take the elevators up to the floor where this person worked, which we figured out was another minute, 2 minutes that we were able to factor into the equation. And we figured out, based on the longest amount of time that it ever took for this person to get from the 42nd Street station to the doors of the World Trade Center, that on that day of September 11th, the latest that they would have arrived in their office would have been approximately 1 minute before the building was hit by the plane, which was not a happy conclusion, but at the same time enabled us to have all of the necessary circumstantial data to provide us with what we needed to reach our halakhic conclusion, that we could safely say that according to the halakhic data, the husband could be declared dead and the wife would be permitted to remarry. It happens in that case subsequently. They also were able to find DNA evidence for a shoulder bone that was found for this individual. So ultimately what we did, after we compiled all of the evidence and after we were able to make the halakhic analysis, we wrote up responsa, we wrote up halakhic reasoning of all of the cases, which was shared with these halakhic authorities throughout the world. If you look in Rabbi Yosef's last volume of his responsa, the Yabia Omer, the 10th volume, you'll find that there's a tshuva there from one of the cases that we had sent to Rabbi Yosef, which is printed in your materials as well. Also in your materials, you'll find an excerpt from the tshuva of Gedaliah Dov Schwartz, who is the Abed, of course, our Rosh Bezdin here in Chicago, and the Bezdin of the Beit of America, who wrote a lengthy response, also resolving all of these cases based on all of the reasoning that was provided and was submitted. And we then wrote letters that we sent to the widows, which officially said that this letter is being issued. I'll just read you a little bit from one of them. This letter is being issued pursuant to your request to have the Beit of America resolve Jewish law matters relating to the tragic death of your husband on September 11, 2001, in connection with the vicious attack on the World Trade Center in New York City. After careful investigation, and in this case, confirmation of the medical examiner's identification of your beloved husband, the Beit of America has concluded as a matter of Jewish law, your husband died on September 11th, corresponding to the 23rd day of Elul, and then we say accordingly his yortzeit should be observed each day on the 23rd day of Elul. It was an official letter, but also one that we tried to make pastorally sensitive. And based on the nature of the resolution of each case, we tailored the language accordingly, but we sent such a letter to each one of the widows. Most of them was sent out in the springtime of 2002. As I said, with the one exception of this poor woman whose husband did not have any other corroborating evidence, where we had to wait a couple of years. But she wasn't in a rush to get remarried, so it all worked out, but I did feel bad about that. People often ask me, were you able to resolve every single case? The answer is yes, but we did it in accordance with halakhic guidelines because we wanted to do everything with a sense of halakhic integrity. So it was really interesting. I'll just end with this, and we'll go on next time to some of the other related issues that we had to deal with. Is that 10 years? This was the 10th anniversary of September 11th. So my wife and I were still living in Riverdale at the time. We didn't move here until 2013. And one of the widows had actually been from Riverdale, from the community where I lived. Her husband davened in the same shul where my family had davened in Riverdale. That was one of the cases that we had to deal with tragically. She subsequently got remarried, and I'll go into that next. So she had actually a son from her first husband after his death, and then she subsequently got remarried, and then she moved out of the community. So her father came over to me on the 10th anniversary, and he said to me, I've been waiting for the right opportunity to say this, but I just really want to express my gratitude and appreciation for the Beit, which was very, very nice. I mean, people in general were very grateful, but I saw he had something that he wanted to say that was that meant a lot to him. And he said, and this was something that really resonated with me, he said it wasn't so much that they had a real doubt in their mind as to whether his daughter's husband had died in the World Trade Center tragedy. I mean, that seemed pretty clear from all of the evidence that was visible to the entire universe. Yes, you might have had this outlying case of the street vendor who was mistakenly identified as dead, but by and large, everybody kind of knew what the story was with all of these missing men. But he said the very fact that Jewish law, that the Torah had a Halakhic framework for dealing with this situation, for giving us a sense of meaning that this is what we do. That we wake up in the morning and we go to Beit and we collect the evidence, and that there's some sort of a process which is conducted by Beit, then there's a letter which is written at the end of the process. That gave a sense of direction, and it provided for a sense of comfort. And it opened up my eyes, and I really felt this during the process as well, to what one of the major purposes of Jewish law is when dealing with these types of situations, which is to provide that sense of meaning, that sense of comfort, that sense of direction. I think that's why so many people from all kinds of different backgrounds turned to the Beit of America for this process, because there was ultimately something very therapeutic about this process. And I think we should all appreciate the fact that we have this context, we have this blessing of what Judaism, what Jewish law, what the Torah provides us for, that for every single situation in life, there is a roadmap, there is some type of a framework, there is some type of a process, and if handled correctly and with sensitivity, it really is able to give us a sense of comfort and a sense of an ability to be able to move on with our lives. So, hopefully this particular subject should be one that we'll only have to discuss in the abstract and as an academic matter for the future, that we should only know Besos Tovos of happy tidings.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.